Absolutely, yes, sir. Man, this is Theology in the Dirt, and we're doing our best to practice our theology in the public square of our homes, our city, and our world. Man, you get sermon notes, links to the rest of our podcasts, and all that good stuff at theologyinthedirt.com. I'm Mitchell Jolly.
And I'm Chris Hayes.
Hey, man, how about we shake and bake?
Let's do it.
Shake and bake.
Shake and bake. Shake and then bake. Shake and bake.
Shake and bake.
It's shake and bake time. Shake and bake, buddy. Shake it before you bake it.
Absolutely. We got to shake and bake, and we're getting after it today. And our topic for Theology in the Dirt, number 148. This is our 148th episode. Pretty wild.
9, right?
You got 149?
I got 149.
I got 148.
Somewhere in there.
Well, how about 148.5? There's a miscounting somewhere. It might be. I know we're getting close to 150.
Yeah, I think the next one's
150. You
think
got
so.
the next one's 150. Okay, well, probably is.
Look at that.
I am the dyslexic guy, so don't take my math. Never take my math. But we're going to talk about today on this episode of Theology in the Dirt, the neurocycle. The neurocycle. And so this is huge because one of the things that's been absent from an awful lot of our evangelical circles is the ability from a biblical perspective, biblical worldview, to teach mental and emotional health and well-being.
Right.
There's all kinds of reasons for that, and maybe that's a podcast in and of itself, but what I really want to dive into today is a practical tool to manage mental and emotional health and well-being. And so I think we've done lots of episodes in the past on, for me personally, how I discovered the need to pay attention to and manage that. And so we're not going to go back and revisit that. Those episodes are there. But what I want to do is provide a tool for people who are struggling, because the reality is the more I talk with people in and outside of our church, the more I pay attention to social media, the more I read, the more I recognize we are definitely at a crisis point with people's emotional, mental well-being. And the reality is that, and again, man, this is important what I'm about to say here. I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm about to say. Because the medical field has been predominantly informed from a naturalistic worldview, the default solution is always chemical. And sometimes it is, sometimes it is not. Because the reality is, as a Christian, we are not merely stuff. We are not a biome alone. We are a physical being created in the image of God, and we are an immaterial being, soul, that has a mind that is not material. It is immaterial. It is spiritual, and we're a mashup of those things. And to merely think that our depression, anxiety, what other thing is there is a function merely of the biome, is to ignore half of what we are.
Right.
And so what we've got to think through is, what does that half of us, that immaterial part of us, do to and affect in regard to that part of us that is physical, which includes our brain and the brain-body connection, how the brain affects the body. And so very few people are speaking into that from a Christian perspective, and there are some who have. Dr. Kirk Thompson, who I've referenced before, Dr. Caroline Leaf, of course, Dr. Karen Purvis and TBRI world, and there are others who are starting to speak into it. There are others I'm leaving out, and if you guys know more that I haven't said, and I've got books on my shelf, I've read their books on the brain, and it's fascinating. Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. And what's interesting is our Bible speaks to this issue. Now, it doesn't give us the neurocycle, but Proverbs 25:2, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, it is the glory of kings to search it out. One of the beautiful things God's given us as co-regents and managers of created orders to go discover natural laws, things that work about the body, about creation. And the discovery of how the brain works is relatively new for us. We're still in the discovery phase of how the brain functions and works.
Yeah, there's like a lot of people I think that believe, it's kind of the old school mindset of, well, if it's not in the Bible, it's not important. Kind of thing, like, well, because the Bible doesn't go into details about the brain, then we don't need to know it. But which I think is completely false. But it's so under researched and underutilized, particularly in the church and among Christians, because I'll get into some of that later, so I want to step on it now. But you're right; it's kind of it's very untapped in our world. It's
untapped, and part of it is we have taken the beautiful Reformation tenet of sola scriptura, that the scriptures alone are how we know salvation and know the will of God and all those beautiful things, theological orthodox truths that keep us in the faith. But sola scriptura is not solo scriptura. And the difference between those two is God has put things in creation for us to discover that he didn't write down in the scriptures. The scriptures will allude to them. For instance, gravity, 9.8 meters per second squared, is not written into the text of the Bible, but it's a physical reality that the Lord Jesus created and wove together into creation. And it's a law that we need to obey or it hurts us, right? These ancient landmarks that God has set up, these statutes God has woven into creation, when we transgress them, we get hurt. And one of those laws is that we are a supernatural, spiritual, and physical being. And when we transgress the law of the Spirit, I made that, like, I don't know if there's a law of the Spirit, but the law of the soul, that we ignore that part of us, we get hurt. And because that part affects the physical part. So we ignore half of who we are, we leave half of us dealt with. Or undealt with. And so it's absolutely essential for us to speak to this. And so what I want to do is dive into a tool. It's the neurocycle that I have found absolutely huge. It's been personally transformative for me. And where it comes from is Dr. Caroline Leaf. Now, Dr. Leaf wrote a book called Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess. And in that book, she does, the first half of the book is the science. There's pictures of fMRIs, so live shots of the brain and how the brain's responding to various things that are happening. It deals with how the truth about the brain, that the brain is plastic, that the brain can be shaped based on experiences, whether it's physical trauma such as explosions. If you're a combat veteran, your brain has been shaped by the impact of explosions and sound and noise, and that comes, that contributes to PTSD and all those kind of things. So the brain is moldable. Absolutely fascinating. And they've done, they have scans of people who've lived in constant states of trauma. And so the brain stem is the place where all the input comes first. It's kind of the gateway, and your fight, flight, freeze, fall, and fib, all those things determine how the rest of your brain functions and then how your body responds. And so if you're living in that constant state of influx of danger, your brain stem is larger than the rest of other people's brain stems, meaning that part of your brain that keeps you in that state of constant alertness is just constantly going. And so it's like muscles. The more you build a muscle, the bigger it gets. The more that brain stem is operating in that fear mode or that flight mode or that fight mode, the bigger it's going to get, the more it's going to operate. In fact, this is interesting. This is totally not in my notes, but Alex Honnold, you ever seen Free Solo? The documentary?
Not all the way through, but parts of it.
I love climbing. I love the climbing world, and Alex Honnold's this stud climber. If you haven't seen Free Solo, I think it's on the Netflix. It's worth watching.
It's not a Star Wars movie.
It's not a Star Wars movie. Yeah. Free Solo is not like Free Han Solo.
From the Carbonite.
Yeah, from the Carbonite. Alex Honnold climbed El Cap with no safety. Free. Like no rope, nothing. Climbed it, and you need to watch it. It's a puckerer, man. Like, it's like you're watching that going, oh my, because there's no falling and surviving. And so fascinating. But they did some MRIs on him, and his brain stem is tiny. And so, because people are like, he just doesn't feel fear, and he talks about not feeling fear. And they did some studies on him, and that amygdala and all that stuff down in there is very tiny. So he's not ruled by fear. And so he is truly like almost emotionless sometimes. He's fearless. So he's just completely logical. Fascinating.
Almost the same effect that you get when you're drunk or high, but without any of those things.
Right.
Like that kind of just complete absence of fear. But everything else is working normally. And
100%.
He's not on the drugs. So it is fascinating that is.
Yeah.
possible.
That's right. And so the rest of your brain is shaped by experiences. And so, and the wild thing is you don't have to be a victim of experiences to shape your brain. You can actually shape your brain by the exercise you do mentally with your brain. So it changes based on use. Information, again, comes into the brainstem and is disseminated to other parts of the brain and then the body. So it's the gatekeeper. How we process that information sets patterns. And it affects the human body. And as a result, those patterns become what Dr. Leaf describes as ruts in a road. Mm-hmm. So if you've ever driven on a muddy road with ruts in it, like on a four-wheeler or four-wheel drive, you notice your vehicle defaults to the ruts. No options. And the effort to get out of those ruts and drive out of those ruts, it takes effort to do that. You got to kick in the four-wheel drive. You got to turn the steering wheel. You got to fight to keep that vehicle outside those ruts. Well, what happens neurologically when we do the same things all the time, have the same patterns, same inputs, and same responses, they build neurological ruts. And so our default is very simply to those same ruts. And we can actually change them, but it's work. This is why mental work is very hard. And so it's easy to respond a certain way when we've pioneered neural pathways that have become ruts. Mm-hmm. It's a 63-day process to change those neural pathways. That's hard because we've heard 20-something days to change a habit. Not true. No. It's 63 days.
3 times as long.
3 times as long to actually fix. And they know this because they can watch neurons working toward those synapses connecting and watch them connect. It's a 63-day process, which is, fascinating. We have the technology to see that happen. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we can watch something that microscopic happen and realize that it's a 63-day process. And so what Dr. Lee suggests doing is the first half of her book is all the science. The second half is the unpacking this neurocycle that she has pioneered, worked in a clinical setting, and found great success. And I would say, yes, it works. Mm-hmm. It's hard, but it works. And I would say, I'm going to say this to people, and I don't want people to misunderstand. If you need medicine, take medicine. You do what you have to do. And at the same time, if you can manage your mind, you're going to be much further down the road of not having to depend on something else, but the gift God gave you to exercise self-control. And what I would argue here is that the neurocycle is a function of self-control. It's a function of disciplining yourself to do what's necessary to cause your brain and body to get in line with truth. And so, again, is there a time and place to get outside help from that? You bet there is. And by all means, do what you have to do. And at the same time, practice the discipline of disciplining your mind, exercising the fruit of self-control.
Real quick, if you don't mind, because I think this fits here. I wrote down the neurocycle. It takes you into a state of mindful awareness and mindful action where you can learn how to process and manage what you've become aware of in your life. Huge. It's kind of an accepting way. So basically, the neurocycle is a way to harness your thinking power and direct the ability of your brain to change, which in it's neuroplasticity is the kind of proper word there if you've ever heard that word. But that's that ability of the brain to change. The neurocycle allows you to kind of harness, kind of control that, and then apply it to how you think and how you act and respond.
Yes, 100%. That's exactly right. And what that implies there is that there are immaterial forces acting on material forces to shape them. Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. And so this is where Thompson's important. Dr. Kirk Thompson, his book, Anatomy of the Soul, I've referred to this multiple times on here because the neurocycle is using the mind, to affect how the brain functions, which then determines how the body functions. But in order to, I think a presupposition of entering into using the neurocycle is to recognize my mind is not my brain. And so Thompson's definition is huge here, and I'm going to read it because I think it's important. It says, and this is Dr. Thompson, MD, medical doctor, the mind is an embodied and relational process emerging from, within, and between brains that regulates the flow of energy and information. That's a packed definition, but it's absolutely essential, and he unpacks it. I'm not going to take time to read it. If you want it, go get the book. Those of you who are YouTubing, that's what it looks like. That definition's on page 29, and his unpacking it is absolutely worth your time. But the mind is this embodied relational process that regulates from within and between brains, that is hemispheres of the brain and people present in relationship to each other, and it regulates the flow of energy and information. And so this exercise of this process of thinking affects the brain and affects the energy flowing inside the brain in the body, and also affects relationally what's happening between people. And so what that helps us to focus on is the fact that the mind is a very powerful component of humanity. And so our thinking, which is what happens in the mind, then dictates how the brain functions, and that dictates how the body functions. That's the brain-body connection affected by the mind, that immaterial part of us. And so what Dr. Leaf captures is this reality of using the mind to begin to regulate that flow of energy and how our brain is functioning. And so what I want to do is share. There are 5 components of neurocycle. I'm going to be very brief with this. And if you want, I have a summary I've typed out, and I've shared it with several people. It's a 1.5-page summary of the second half of her book. I would encourage you to buy the book and get in depth with it, but I've got a summary just for myself, and it's helped other. They say, hey, you got the tool, and I got a 1.5-page summary that'll help you. I keep a copy, a small version, glued in my journal, so that when I really need to process some stuff, I go look at it, remind myself, and I do this. So 5 steps. I'm going to give them to you a little bit out of order. She gives them in order. I'm going to start with number 3 as number 1, because every time I do this, the third step for Dr. Leaf is write all this down. I start with write because I write it all down. I got to remind myself, write it. Yeah. So step number 1 is write. God put us together to be communicating beings, and part of that communication is written communication. It's just a part of the way God wired us, and the brain works that way. And so the neurological connection between your fingers and holding an instrument and writing with it is part of the learning process. And so just, if you want to get into science, read the book. And as an educator, I saw this in the classroom. It is imperative that you write stuff. Pick up a pencil, pick up a pen, pick up a marker, an Apple Pencil on your iPad. Do something with an implement in your hand, left or right-handed. Put it down onto something in which your thoughts are captured on some implement. All right, so you got to write.
Helps you get to the root of the issues better if you write it down than if you're just kind of trying to think about it.
Correct. Writing is actually a form of meditation. Your brain gets into a meditative state when you're writing, which is a state of rest. And a state of rest is a state of focus. And when you're writing and you're anxious, you can actually begin to wrestle anxiety to the ground by writing stuff down. I know that's weird, and if you haven't tried it, it works.
Small side note, coloring has a similar effect.
Yes.
If you get print out coloring pages, get you some color pencils. I recommend that over markers, because there's just different shading things that happen that are, anyway. Sorry, but it's true. I used to do that when I worked in some really tough environments. Yeah, which is one of the reasons kids, you'll find some kids who are stressed and anxious, they will figure that out and not even realize what they're doing. They will color. And it's hard to pull them away from it because they're relaxed. I have a coloring app on my iPad and a painting app on my iPad that's awesome. Yeah. And it helps you focus. So with an implement, you're doing all this stuff, and it's amazing. Yeah, get some crayons, get some coloring sheets and color. It's fascinating. So writing is a healing tool God gave us. So Dr. Leaf, they know neurologically that writing affects the brain. Increases learning, increases focus. So write this down. So number 1's write. Number 2, you want to gather. And this is the part where you sit with a journal and you capture the awareness of how you're feeling physically and mentally. So you want to tune in. And so I write down gather, dash, and I start paying attention to my body. Do I feel tight in my chest? Is my stomach feel upset? Is there a tension in my shoulders? Is there an ache somewhere that's beyond arthritis? It's like, I can't explain that. Because one of the things that neurology has figured out is that they can ask the question, someone may ask the question is, where are you feeling that sadness? And it's interesting, an awful lot of sadness is felt in the bowels.
absolutely fascinating. And which is the Bible will talk about this. Like, when they speak of the heart, for them, the lev, the Hebrew lev is the heart. That's a word for bowels. Mm-hmm. And so they recognize that they felt those deep emotions in their guts, rumbling, tumbling tummy. And so you want to pay attention. Like, is it my gut? Is it my chest? Is it my back? Pay attention to how you feel. Connect that. Like, do I feel sad? Is it a combination of sadness and anger? You may find all these different emotions. Mm-hmm. Write them down.
Yeah, when you start gathering awareness of the warning signals that are evident in the patterns of your life, it actually activates your frontal lobe of the brain.
Yeah.
It increases beta and gamma activity in the brain waves across both the left and the right sides, which actually helps us become more mindful and helps us process what we call our internal state of being.
Yep.
And so the warning signals, but they include emotions. And I think a lot of times we separate these, but they actually include emotions. And this goes to what you're saying. So for example, depression or anxiety, it also includes behaviors such as maybe withdrawing or aggression and physical signs like heart palpitations or gut issues.
Yeah.
A lot of times gut issues are not directly just related to what you're eating, but to the emotions and the inability and lack of awareness of those emotions and how they're affecting you.
That's right.
And so by gathering this information, writing it down, like you said, you start to become aware of that and you can start to connect the dots.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And by writing that down, you're reinforcing that learning and being able to be aware. And this gathering, this awareness, once you do this on paper for a while, it starts to become habit. You can, throughout the day, you can recognize, why did I feel that flush of heat? Like you start to recognize your brain and body's response to perceived threats, and you start realizing, well, why do I feel threatened?
And it's an admittance for yourself of something's wrong, which is often the hardest step. We kind of joke about that in a lot of other areas of life, but it matters with this kind of stuff too. It's like just taking the steps to say, hey, something's not right.
Yeah.
And if you can get to that, this becomes much more impactful. But you can't do any of these steps until you've at least acknowledged there's something happening. You may only be seeing the signs of them and not know what it means yet, but at least acknowledging that and saying, okay,
that's right.
There's something not right within me, and I need to get to the source of what it is.
That's right. And sometimes people who've undergone an awful lot of trauma will find they will find themselves reacting to a threat that's not even present. It's because their body has stored that. And it's trying to let you know that there's something in it that's not right. You feel this threat, but there's nothing to be threatened by. And it's being aware of doing this process. You become aware of, like, I need to process some stuff. And that's where you can have some conversations with people. It's like, hey, Chris, do you mind? I got something I need to work out. Can we talk? Yeah, absolutely. And you start talking that out, and it's almost like when they watch this on fMRIs, they see the brain begin to cool down when people start to name this stuff and acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. And I'm convinced that takes us back to Genesis 1 and 2, where the Lord gave Adam the authority to name things, and whatever he called them, that's what it was. Like that's more than just Adam having a job. That was his job, and that's important, that vocational task of naming the animals. But naming things is important, which is why in the Bible they were never flippant about names. There's something about exercising control and self-control, God-given self-control, when we put a name on something. And when you can gather and recognize that's attention, that's fear, that's anger, that's angst. And angst is fear. Anxiety is on the spectrum of what fear is. So recognizing that low-level anxiety, that's a fear. What am I? And your brain begins to, like, it's almost like your central nervous system is waiting on your mind to go, I see you. And then it's like, all right, my job's done. I'm good. Thank you. You've got it. I've handed the baton off. You got it now. And your central nervous system just starts relaxing. And you're like, ah. So by naming it, your mind recognizing it, what's going on, your body's like, okay, job's done.
I think we're afraid to name it. And I think it's for the same reason that where medication has become overused,
correct,
so has labels.
Yes, that's right.
And when we over-label, particularly kids in school, oh, that kid's ADD, that kid's ADHD, that kid, or that's a bad kid, that kid's got some kind of problem, he's got a learning disability, which some of those are true, but because they label everybody, everything before really taking time to dive into what's going on, or as we talk about TBR, the history behind it and what might be driving that. and this is just speculation, but I would be willing to bet there's a reason why more people are struggling with this now than ever is because partially we're afraid to. We don't want to call it anxiety because we don't want to be either labeled or known as a person who has anxiety. We don't want to name it depression because there's stigmatisms that come with depression.
Right.
You know, are they going to think I'm going to take my life? Are they there's just a lot that happens in the brain when we start to do that. And while that's understandable, I just say all that to say I agree with you because I think we have to call it something. So even if you need to make another word for it, I prefer you use what it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think that's probably what's causing fewer people to do these things is because they're either afraid to label it or they're afraid other people are going to label them.
Sure, that's a good point. I think that's very true. Well, that leads to this next part. You know, it's write, reflect. Or write and gather, and then third, reflect. So you think, okay, why? Reflecting is asking why. Why is my gut feeling a little uneasy? Why am I tense? Why does my chest hurt? Am I having a heart attack? Or is that something else? Why is this going on? So basically reflection is you being curious. You're asking why. And you're getting into trying to figure out, and typically we know why, we just have a tendency to avoid it. We know why we're feeling nervous. Maybe it's that thing coming up at the end of the week or that confrontation I have to have with somebody, or I'm expecting a conflict, or I remember what happened to me. You know the why, it's just for whatever reason, I think the dark kingdom wants us to avoid it. And so sometimes it's fear that's keeping us. Maybe it's shame keeping us from actually stating what it is, but it's being curious. It's following the trail back to the source. And so we reflect. We ask the curious question, why? Yeah,
that reflection acts as a glue between the left side and the right side of our brain. Right. It makes it more coherent between the two and a balance. Yeah. And what that does is it makes us more introspective. And when we become more introspective, it really changes how we do everything.
That's right.
And so it's a crucial step. And it's in that order on purpose because you can't reflect on something until you've taken time to call it out, say what it is, write it down.
That's right.
But then say, okay, now that I know what the problem is, you're asking that, okay, why, and getting into that. So it's a really neat how that balances the two sides of the brain.
Yeah. Well, when we live in one hemisphere, we're setting ourselves up for problems.
Correct.
And so it's that capacity to logically connect the emotion, one side of the brain, to its processing on the other side of the brain. Mm-hmm. And only in that process are we functioning in the full capacity. I know it's full capacity, but I mean both hemispheres simultaneously. And that's essential for mental and emotional well-being.
That's how we're designed to work. But it doesn't work that way because we don't ask why.
That's right. We don't ask why. And then fourth, it's recheck. What she calls recheck. And that is thinking back over your reflections. So you write your reflections down, you're trying to ask why, and you're being an investigator. This is date myself, but Columbo was awesome.
I thought you were going to say Matlock, but he was a lawyer.
Yeah, he was a lawyer. Matlock was awesome too. He had some good private investigators. But man, Columbo was awesome. I know that's old school, but he came off as this kind of stupid, dumb guy, but he's brilliant. Mm-hmm. And so you're an investigator. You're asking why. You're trying to build the trail. Rechecking is looking back at your reflection and asking some questions. And it's like, okay, this is what I found. And now you're asking this question in the recheck. What can I change? Do I have the authority and power to change something here? Or maybe you put yourself in a position of giving advice to somebody who found themselves in that situation. Like, what would I say to somebody? What advice would I give? You maybe start to recognize toxic patterns or even healthy patterns. Maybe the neurocycle, you're like, I feel really happy today. And I feel very joyful today. And it's like, what patterns led to that? So you're looking for patterns. Yeah. And then what assumptions am I making in my thinking, right? And so sometimes our fear and anxiety is a result of assumptions we're making, not facts. Mm-hmm. We're way far down the line of assuming something as opposed to it actually being reality. And this place of rechecking makes us go back over our reflection and identify that stuff.
I go to, you ever watch House?
Yeah.
He's a doctor, but he's really an investigator.
He's the guy with the cane, too,
right?
He's
kind of a not the nicest guy. He's kind of a jerk. But what he does well, and I feel like what really good doctors do well, is they don't just say, okay, they don't just look at something and say, what is that telling me? That's got to be the answer.
Right.
Sometimes they do, and they may misdiagnose, and that, we're talking about the difference in life or death.
Right.
And what good doctors do, and what a lot of the show House is about, is looking past that. And it's like, it's you're trying to gain perspective, but try to figure out a way to see what's happening that's differently.
Yeah.
Like not just what does it look like at a quick glance, but looking at all the different angles. Again, this step can't happen without the other steps.
That's right.
But when you get to that point, you really do, you can increase the interaction and functionality of the brain to see more clearly and to see more angles, as opposed to just what the first symptom or the first thing that you see tells you.
That's huge. Absolutely. And then the last step is reach. Mm-hmm. This is the action. Like everything, and this is an educational component too. Our thinking needs to be shaped, but it also has to have an outlet physically. Mm-hmm. There has to be something to do. And so the reach is the action step. And one of the things I like that Dr. Leaf suggests is, rather than make a to-do list, make a to-don't list. Because sometimes it's like I've done the wrong thing mentally and emotionally. I've gone down maybe the wrong path. And so for me, a to-don't list is very helpful. And so I'll make a list of things to not do. and so you might think about making a to-don't list. Maybe a to-do list works better for people, but it's an action step. It's things I can tangibly do. And it's like, don't do this again. Don't do that again. Don't make that assumption again. And don't allow your mind to think that thought again, which then turns into, if it's a to-don't, then the flip side of that is there's a positive action to do. Mm-hmm. So if I'm not to go look at that text message again, then what I want to do is replace that with, do go look at Philippians 4:8, whatever is lovely, whatever is pure, whatever is holy, whatever is admirable, think on those things. And so so once I know what not to do, then what to do becomes super clear for me. And so the reach is, I need an action step, and it's don't do this, but then go and do that.
Too bad John's not here, because I'm going to talk about work breakdown structure. But when you draw out something, many of you have seen that. You see the little bubbles when you do that. There's often, you see one bubble and it says, okay, do this if this, and then outside that's usually two ways, or it's a question and it'd be like, yes. If so, then this, and no, then go here. Like there's a place to go for the do's and the don'ts.
Yeah, that's right.
And they fit together. And when it's done really well, I think it's almost good to have both the do and the don't list, because if you just have the don't list, which I think is a good idea, then, but if you have the don't list, but then don't have an alternative,
sure,
then you're not teaching yourself.
That's good. The
right actions to take. You're withholding the bad actions, which, again, that's not to knock that.
Sure.
But I think when you get to that place of health and you've done this neurocycle sometimes more than one time,
right?
Then you get to that place and you're, okay, I've gotten better at the don'ts, but I need the right do's coming off of that.
That's good.
So being able to follow that pattern, and that's ultimately what helps break cycles.
Man, that's good. That's good stuff. I've got some results of that, but what else do you want to share with us there before I share some of what the neurocycle has helped me do? Yeah,
absolutely. I just mentioned it, but I think one of the things the neurocycle does really well by intention is break cycles. The process begins with deliberate and intentional mindfulness, which activates our self-regulation, and then it helps us go beyond mindfulness into mind management. And that kind of self-regulation that's achieved during the neurocycle it's a great way to deal with the root of those toxic, sometimes generational cycles. It's not even just within us, but it's stuff that's been kind of imputed into us because of generational circumstances.
Yeah.
It's the reason why, when I worked in foster care, why you'd see the same family, you see this mom, their kid would come into care, but she was in care and her mom was in care.
Yeah.
And it's because of generational toxic cycles in them.
Yeah.
And so, and all this can be dealt with and done during using those 5 steps. But I kind of, to put it in simpler terms, and you talked about her book, because sometimes when our brain is a mess, and the neurocycle is the process to clean it. So I look at it, some of us use programs on our computers like Clean My Mac, Norton Antivirus, and what that does is it sweeps through our computer, helps clean out any bad files, finds toxic processes, potential threats, and it helps restore it to its proper working order. I think the same way the neurocycle does that for our mind. Allows us to be basically what's, if you're an HGTV fan, it helps you become the interior designer of your brain.
Yeah.
Like if your home is, somebody broke into your house and wrecked everything, like first thing you do is have to acknowledge that there's a mess in here.
Yeah.
But it's not a Mary Poppins fix where you just sing and snap your fingers and everything gets back in place.
Right.
You have to, it's hard to, you've got to process that, and then you've got to begin to put things back together into the right places that they go.
It's like having Ben and Aaron come in and redesign I love Hometown, Jennifer.
Oh yeah,
Ben and Aaron's awesome.
They're awesome.
Yeah.
Or Joanna Gaines,
Yeah.
Chip and Joanna. So yeah, but they're not available, so you've got to do it. So
Yeah, Ben and Aaron can't come into my mind.
But the Neurocycle helps you do that.
That's
and,
right.
Just to kind of put that in a little bit more of a simpler, more everyday life kind of picture.
That's good.
But it can break those cycles. And when you are attentive enough and focused enough to do it, like 63 days is not a long time.
No.
Like it's not like this takes 2 or 3 or 4 years.
Right.
It can if you're not doing the proper steps and you're not getting help. But to think that it's possible to do that in 2 months is really encouraging, I think.
It's hugely encouraging. Absolutely, 100%.
Hard.
Yeah, it's hard, absolutely, but absolutely encouraging that I can make progress in 2 months. And I want to put this caveat: do not hear us telling you take your medicine, stop that. We're not saying that.
No.
You consult your doctor if you're using medication. Do not hear us say stop it, and do not go stop it without your doctor giving you input in that. But what I do want you to hear us say is that you can take control of your brain and your body, and it is hard work. It is difficult work. And, but the encouraging thing is that if you can gut out 63 days, you will be so far down the road of learning and growing in ways that you never thought you could be able to. And that's fascinating to me, but also encouraging.
Yeah. So I want you to get to your part, because I think that's going to be important here, how those results are.
Yeah.
And then I have a question that's going to kind of take us into a little bit different direction.
Yeah.
But bring us back to the theology and the dirt side and why we're covering this on a theology podcast. If that
Absolutely.
makes sense. So,
you got it. Absolutely. So what's the result for me? I would say number one, resiliency. What it did for me was create this capacity to take a hit and bounce back faster, as opposed to take a hit and take a month and a half to like just be whatever. It's like, oh my gosh, or depressed or anxious. Like I can absorb a hit and boom, bounce back quicker because I can process those things better. I actually have a methodology for processing.
Yeah.
So resiliency is a big deal.
That's good.
Number two, it puts me in a position to interdict the negative work of depression and anxiety. And so depression and anxiety is like, there's so much there. We probably ought to do a podcast at some point about what depression is and what anxiety is exactly. But you interdict, you get in the way of depression and anxiety when you get in the process of managing your brain and your body. And so one of those is one thing that contributes to depression and anxiety. Number one is spiraling. Like you get in and you ruminate. Rumination is the word I'm looking for. You ruminate on something. You cycle back over and over and over again. You sit and you dwell on it. You dwell on it. You dwell on it. What happens is you start hanging out in one side, in one part of your brain, and usually it's in your brain stem. It's usually in the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, fib area. And what ends up happening is through ruminating, you put your brain in this state of a depressive state. And so the neurocycle helps you get out of that state. It makes you start using your whole brain. And so it interdicts that process. It creates depression. Fear is maybe the most devastating emotion to the human brain. And so by processing, in fact, fear is one of the hardest to recuperate from. Fear is one of the chief causes of depression. And so again, fear is a spectrum. There's terror, and then there's just low-level nervousness. All that's fear. And so this neurocycle helps you interdict that, helps you break off that cycle. So that's huge. And so then it makes recovery quicker.
Because fear breaks us down to survive or not, and nothing else matters. And when you do that, there's zero processing, there's zero acknowledgement of emotions. It's just about continuing to breathe. Yeah. And that there's not a worse place to be stuck in.
That's right. And then third for me, the neurocycle is a practical tool to implement Philippians 4:8, which tells us whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, whatever is excellent and worthy of praise, think on these things. I love how the scriptures teach us about thinking without giving us into the neurobiology in the background. What I think, this is just my hunch here, because we live on the other side of naturalism as a worldview, which sees us as a complete biome. And so therefore, for us to rediscover the supernatural, immaterial parts of humanity and creation, we feel like we're discovering this whole brand new thing. You're like, oh my gosh. Well, for the writers of the Old Testament, New Testament, they lived in a world of unseen reality that affected seen reality. And so for Paul to say things like, think about, he understood clearly as a Jewish Hebrew thinker in a Greek world, he understood the unseen components of mankind and spiritual forces. And so for him to speak to thinking, the assumption of the unseen was already firmly in place. Does that make sense? Like I hope what I'm saying there makes sense. And so when he's talking about thinking, he's already assuming his readers understood. There's immaterial processes that we bring to bear on our bodies, because he's speaking to this church at Philippi, and he's speaking about Euodia and Syntyche particularly agreeing in the Lord. And says, so therefore don't be anxious about anything. Don't let anxiety rule you. You guys need to agree. Don't be anxious, but in everything by prayer and petition and thanksgiving, bring your request to God. Then the peace of God that passes all understanding guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And then he follows it up, verse 8. So whatever is lovely, admirable, excellent, all these things, think on those things. Meaning this immaterial process of the mind is intended for you to set your mind on the right things that then teaches you how to pray, agree, and pray, and then experience peace. And so the neurocycle is a practical way to put Philippians 4:8 into practice. It makes me think on the right things. And when I think on the right things, then I can pray right. When I pray right, I have peace. So the neurocycle helps me do Philippians 4:6-8. And then the last thing I have is I have found the neurocycle is a practical way to do 2 Corinthians 3:10, 3-5. And I want to come back and actually do more on this. But we talk about take every thought captive. And I think we need to talk about how to take every thought captive. But Paul says, verse 3-5, 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5, for though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh. Now that's a big statement. So we're here in the flesh, but our warfare is not according to flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but they have divine power to destroy strongholds. So what's a stronghold? Well, he defines it in verse 5. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. And so our weapons are not of the flesh, they're divine, and they are intended to destroy strongholds, and those are arguments and opinions raised against the knowledge of God. And what? Take every thought captive to obey Christ. And so what I found in the neurocycle, using the mind to control what my brain does and what my body does, is a tangible, practical way to take those thoughts that are creating anxiety and fear and all this other stuff and make them get in line with Jesus and his kingdom. Because what's happening in fear is it is injecting a counter narrative to God's care for me. And what the dark kingdom says is he does not care for you. If he did, this would not be happening. If he were present, this would clearly not be happening. And so when that's going on, I'm afraid, I'm anxious, I'm nervous, all those things. And what I have to do is get in there, that's a stronghold. That's an opinion and an idea that's raised against the knowledge of God. So what am I supposed to do? I got to take that captive. Yeah. And I've got to make that obey Christ. And that's where that to-do and to-don't list is very helpful here. It was like, this is a lie. So I need to flip that around and say, no. He is present with me, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I fear no evil because you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And that's where, that's the battle right there. And man, we can dive into that battle. Man, we're reversing some stuff, man. And so it helps me practice what I find in the Bible. What does it mean to take thoughts captive? And How am I supposed to think on good stuff when there's so many bad things? Well, the neurocycle is a tool to help you do that. I'm convinced they knew that innately because they had a supernatural worldview, and we're having to relearn it because we're waking up from the slumber of naturalism, and we're having to relearn immaterial, unseen realities that affect our physical existence. So that's all I got.
That's good. Kind of stepped on my question and my scriptures a little bit here.
I'm sorry.
But it's okay. I'm going to ask it anyway because in case you have some other thoughts on it. So what I wanted to do was basically ask, like, how do we connect this with our spiritual lives? But you kind of did that.
Yeah.
So why talk about this on the Theology podcast? I've got some thoughts, but I want to hear some more of yours because I feel like the church stays egregiously silent on topics like this. And instead we just tell people to listen and obey and trust God or just pray about it. And I think going back to what you were just talking about with the Philippians is some of these verses, we read these verses and we're like, hey, if you just pray about it, then you won't be anxious. So just pray about it. But we skip the steps of the neurocycle and the logical things that, no, this person's brain can't just pray about it because, well, there's lots of reasons why, but they can't connect to that. It's not a matter of belief at that point. It's just a different animal going on, and I think we've got to find a way to fit these two together because I think they're intended to fit together.
Can I let me say right there, because while it's fresh, because I think you're going to lead to me saying this, but it's just in my mind right now. We have a tendency to think of prayer as only talking to God.
Yes.
Prayer is also thinking on the truths of God and being quiet with our mouths and our voices, but it's being in a reception. It's been a place of reception. It's being a place of listening, and what we're doing in the neurocycle is listening. Pete Scazzaro makes this, and I think he's right. He said, if you don't know yourself, you're not going to know God will. And I think Scazzaro's right on because we're made in the image of God, and by paying attention to ourselves and how we're feeling in the moment, we're tuning into the processes God created. And then when we're paying attention to those, we're paying attention to Him. And it very well could be that He is speaking to us and getting our attention through these processes. He's going, Jolly, hey, listen up. And by listening and being quiet, I'm actually in a state of prayer because I'm in a state of listening for Him to speak to me, listening for Him to guide me and give me direction, and for the Holy Spirit to bring Scripture to bear. And so part of that prayer component is not me talking, but it's me sitting in a place of listening. And the neurocycle makes me sit in a place of listening, and that is also prayer. Yeah,
that's good. And I don't want to downplay prayer by any means. I think we have to pray about it. I feel like sometimes it's used as if you just offer it up, then it's going to be fine.
We're thinking exactly like you're talking about. We say those words, and whether we intend it to or not, what we have in mind is a one-dimensional me telling God stuff, as opposed to this incredibly robust concentration on the Lord, where the neurocycle can actually be a task of prayer.
And the neurocycle, seeing it as a gift of the Lord to help you get out of that place that you can connect with Him.
That's right. Because what we can't be doing is letting Buddhists and Hindus who know how to quiet their mind have more peace than us when they are actually under the condemnation of God because they know how to pay attention to their minds. And I'm like, that's not because they're in the truth. They're in the dark kingdom. But they paid attention to this, and we've ignored it. And so what God's saying to us, I think, is wake up. Wake up, wake up, wake up. These are things I've given to you. Use them. Put my name on them because they're true. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's good. That helps answer some of that. Because I think for me, like, we focus so much on the heart, and when it comes to the Bible and the Christian life, like, how many times do we say or hear, well, that's just a heart issue, and it's true that's not to ignore the heart, but also the scriptures talk a lot about the mind, and there's just a few that came to my mind. Isaiah 26:3, you keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you because he trusts in you. Romans 8:6, for to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the spirit is life and peace. And it's so interesting that peace is used so many times with the mind. Yeah. Because, again, we're talking about not being at peace. Right. Romans 12:2, one of my favorites, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect, implying that your mind needs renewing because it's a mess. Yeah. 2 Corinthians 2:5, you read that one already. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. We'll talk about that soon.
Yeah.
You already read through Philippians 4:6-8, so I won't read that again. But again, just whatever's true, whatever's honorable, whatever's just, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's commendable, any excellence, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things.
It's huge.
Colossians 3:2, last one, set your mind on things that are above, not on things on the earth. And I just unpack that, like to set our mind on something, it's to fix it, to fasten it tightly. It's not like just a stray thought or a quick memory. It's a focus to fixate on something tightly. And I think the only way we could do that is to get rid of all the other junk taking up space. And my kind of final thought, kind of going to that, in your sermon back on Pure Religion Sunday last month, you said, integrate mental, emotional work into your daily Bible reading and journaling to help you exercise self-control with your mind to get your brain and body to line up so that you can get in the fight. I think that's a perfect action item, and it will also align with my Hayes takeaway number 3 in just a minute. But this integration between like reading the Bible, renewing our minds, getting control over our emotions and our response to those emotions, I think is paramount to great growth and development in really every facet, but specifically spiritually, being able to connect those two things. And I think that helps with the do's and don'ts list because the Bible's full of both of those.
Yeah, that's right.
Do not be anxious, but through prayer and supplication, make your request. So even that's in that one verse, there's a don't and a do. And so by aligning scriptures and reading through that, even just a little bit as you're trying to get healthy and as you're trying to go through the neurocycle, because what you're doing is you're now putting in truth. And when the more truth you put in there, the less room there is for untruths. Yeah. And because the world's full with that. And so I love that point that you made. I think that's a great application. I didn't put that in my takeaways because it's not my takeaway, but I think it's a great action item. Yeah. And you can go back because you talked about the 5 steps in that sermon as well. Yeah.
Before you do your takeaways, just this beautiful reality that for me, I have learned to integrate my Bible reading with practicing the neurocycle. So I journal. I've been an avid journaler for a lot of years in the sense of I open my Bible and I sit down in front of paper with a pencil. I use a pencil and I go through a journal a year and I fill it up. Every day I got the scriptures. I read through my Bible every year. And so I'm reading and processing. So what I've done is be able to integrate the truth of the scriptures with that process. And so and how I do that, I actually don't have a process. It's just become what I do. And so as I'm reading, I'm trying to gather and I'm reflecting and I'm writing and I'm rechecking and I'm reaching, and because I'm letting the text speak to me. And I just believe God and his word is so supernaturally powerful that he brings that integration so that I'm aware of how Proverbs 25:2, he's hidden some things for us to discover. When I've discovered that beautiful Easter egg. And so what I've done with my Bible reading is I just let those things fall in line. And so as I'm reading the text, I'm gathering and I'm writing and I'm reflecting and I'm checking and then I'm reaching. And so the reach is application. So I'm trying to apply what I've read that day. And so I just encourage people as you make it a discipline to read your Bible, make it a discipline to journal, make it a discipline to know how your brain and body works, and you write that stuff down, man, we're well on our way to becoming a powerful people that can manage ourselves really, really well.
You know what that sounds like?
What's that?
Romans 12:2. What you just described, because think about it, it's do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world. The only way to not conform to the patterns of that world are to conform to his patterns and his word. Yeah. And the only way to be transformed by the renewing of our mind is to not conform to him, to the world, but to him. Yeah. And so to me, what you're describing is a practical, everyday application of that, of how to live that verse out. That's great.
Amen. What's it got for our takeaways?
Hayes takeaways. Number 1, the brain is a fascinating, incredible, and very complex part of who we are. You don't need to be a brain surgeon or psychologist to understand how it works, but it's important to know how you process information and how your emotions can take your thoughts captive and control your actions. Wow. This is how we grow and change and break toxic cycles in our minds. And when we do that, we open up ourselves to a completely new and free perspective on life. Number 2, a lot of people struggling with things and either rejecting the neurocycle or thinking they don't need it are those who are minimizing the depth of their struggles. So whether someone helped you do that or you did it on your own, don't think you're above needing this or that you're alone. The first step of that self-awareness and admitting there's something off. And then finally, and this connect with what I was talking about earlier, it's impossible to focus on Christ and on self. It's impossible to put him first when our mind isn't free. So think of the neurocycle as a preparation stage for worship. Maybe this will help. So if you know you have company coming to your house, right? It's that time of that year, right? It's Christmas season.
Yep.
What do, right? You clean the house, you organize, you order food, you wrap presents, you think through plans, you think through where people are going to be in your house and making sure that everything is ready.
Yeah.
You're preparing. And I think we need to do that sometimes before we come to the altar or to his table. Not because we have to, because he tells us we can come as we are.
Yeah.
But I think for some of us, we can come as we are, but we need this preparation step because it helps us see the blockage between us and Christ, and it gives us time to remove that so that we can see him and hear from him more clearly and be able to worship him freely. So your worship life, and not just Sunday mornings, will change immensely when you prepare and clean and transform your mind.
Amen. Well said, man. Well, guys, thank you for joining with us on this journey. Ask if you have questions. So I'm asking you, do you have questions? And if there are questions about what we've talked about today, hit us up at theologyinthedirt@gmail.com. Glad to interact with you. But also, you may have a question we can bring back on here and use to get deeper into this subject. We recognize in the time frame that we allow ourselves that we are not completely exhausted, but I trust you have questions, and those questions can help us go deeper. And so our aim and everything we do here is to make sure that the people that God has given us to steward have access to information where we're trying to actually put our theology into practice. We can't do all of this from the pulpit. We recognize that. We only have a short amount of time every week to be with one another and in the capacity God's given us to teach. And so we want to, in the time and space we live right now, God's given us a vehicle such as podcasts to be able to go deeper and to explore topics in all manner of ways that we can't do on a Sunday morning. So if you have questions and want us to go deeper, shoot them to us, theologyinthedirt@gmail.com. For all you other folks, we are so thankful for who listen to Theology in the Dirt, who live in other parts of the world and other parts of our state. We are so thankful for you listening, and we are appreciative. So for all you guys who listen, please feel free to share the podcast, leave a 5-star rating, leave a comment. That helps its circulation. And so as you do that, hopefully we can be of better service to the Lord and achieve the vision that God's given us as a local church, so that every disciple everywhere all the time is helping expand the gospel and the kingdom of God advancing. Thank you for listening. Thank you for participating in all that. We appreciate it. We'll see you next time. Out.